Well, how are we doing today? You guys feeling good this afternoon? Are you alive, awake? You with me? Okay, well, it's going to be a long 32 minutes, but no, I'm just kidding. Hey, listen, let me address the elephant in the room. If you came today and you were expecting to see Dan Matlock, our fearless pastor up here, I've got some bad news, and that is that you are unfortunately stuck with me today. And if you don't know me, my name's Steve. I'm one of the pastors on the team here. And I think if I've gotten good at maybe one thing over the last few years, it is standing on stages just like this and disappointing people that I'm not Dan Matlock. So I get it. It's all good. I remember last week I was grabbing dinner at this restaurant, and I ordered a Coke, and they brought me out like a Pepsi. And I had this moment where I was just totally let down because I'm like, I ordered a Coke, like I didn't want a Pepsi. I mean, I guess since I'm here, I'll just take it, but I'm not real happy about it. And that's kind of where we're at right now this morning. So let's just stay with me this morning. We're going to have some fun. But I remember back when I was 16 years old and I bought my very first car. Does anybody remember your very first car? Anybody in here? Okay, because it was a moment for me. Because I remember when I got those keys for the first time. And it wasn't just like, oh, I'm going to go drive. No, it was like a ticket to freedom, okay? Like, I mean, I had like dreamed about that moment. And I finally got my car. And it was a classic. I got a 1996 Plymouth Neon, which you can see right here. And as you can tell, me and this car have a lot of history together. We've been through some rough patches. Didn't have windows for a little while, but duct tape and plastic served me well. It was an amazing car. Okay, I love this car. And I remember about 6 months after I got this car, I was driving on my way to work. I was driving on the interstate. I was heading to Fast Walk, which was the fast food Chinese place that I worked at the time, and which is another story for another day. But I'm driving to work, and I'm on the interstate. This car just flies by me and then cuts me off to pass me. And I remember thinking, like, what the heck? Like, this car he could have just went by me, but he had to cut me off? Like, what's going on? And so me being the cool, level-headed 16-year-old that I was, I thought to myself, like, I'm not going to stand for this. Like, I deserve better than this. And so I decide, I'm gonna retaliate, right? So I do what you do when you're 16 and you're in this situation. I floor it, right? I go as fast as this 1996 Plymouth Neon can possibly go, and I drive to try to catch back up to this guy, and I'm just cruising to try to be able to pass him back up to try to, kind of get back on him. Now, there's a couple things that you have to understand. There's a couple parts to this story for it to make sense. The first thing is that I'm on the interstate driving, but I'm kind of going from one interstate to another. So I'm on one of those like ramps that kind of like shoot you up and kind of banks to the left. You know what I'm talking about? So that's where I'm driving. I'm on that ramp. And the other thing you have to understand is that right before I left to go to work that day, it had just been raining. And so the roads were a little bit slick. Some of you can kind of see where this is going. So I floor it. I got the pedal to the metal. I'm going as fast as this car will take me. And I finally catch up to this guy, and I kind of like get next to him, and he kind of makes eye contact with me. And I'm like, what, dude? You want to fight? Because I'm ready. I'm 16, and I'm ready to go, And so I floor it. I get ahead of him, and I'm about to take the victory moment where I cut him back off and pass him and show him who truly is the boss, right? And then as soon as I turn the wheel to get into his lane, as soon as I do that, because it was so slick and like the angle that I'm going at, all of a sudden, the second I did that, my car loses control. And I start to spin. And I'll never forget it because it was like I was in this moment and everything was like slow motion all of a sudden. It was like time froze. I'll never forget thinking to myself, I remember it vividly. I thought in that moment, oh my gosh, I wish I would have buckled up before I left. But I didn't because I'm 16 and I'm an idiot, right? And so all of a sudden the car is spinning, everything's in slow motion. There's this split second where I'm face to face with this car coming at me. I'm in his lane, facing the wrong way at like 75 miles per hour. It's insane. And I barely miss him, and I'm flying towards the edge of this ramp where I'm about to fly off this steep edge onto another interstate. And right before I fly off the edge, I slam straight into a guardrail. And it was the most incredible thing, thank God, because I amazingly was able to get up out of that accident, completely unscathed. I mean, I didn't have a scratch on me. I was completely healthy, no injury whatsoever. And honestly, my car survived, and it really wasn't in as bad of shape as it should have been for the speed that I was going, at that time. And it was all because of a guardrail. And that's really what we've been talking about in this series, as we've kind of defined guardrails as this. A guardrail is a system that's designed to keep vehicles like mine from straying into dangerous or off-limit areas, such as flying off a bridge onto another interstate, right? Like, had that guardrail not been there that day, I unquestionably would have totaled my car at the very least, but probably would have landed in the hospital, could have hurt other people, right? But because that guardrail was there, it was able to save me from something that no doubt could have altered the course of the rest of my life. And see, what we've been talking about over the last few weeks, if you've missed any of these weeks, is we've been talking about how the highway isn't the only place that you and I need guardrails, but we actually need guardrails in our lives, right? Because for some of us, in fact, probably all of us, had we have had some relational guardrails, or perhaps some moral guardrails, or maybe some financial guardrails like we talked about last Sunday, man, we could have saved ourselves from a lot of trouble. We could have saved ourselves from a lot of unnecessary pain and heartache in some situations if we'd only had guardrails. And that really is true. As we continue this conversation today, I want to talk about an area of our life that's a lot like that bridge or that ramp that I was driving on that day when I was 16. Because had that guardrail not been there and I would have flown off the edge, it's not just a minor setback or inconvenience. No, it would have been dangerous. It would have caused perhaps irreparable damage to my life and maybe to the lives around me. And see, the area that I want to talk about today is one that, if left unchecked, has the potential to derail your life, has the potential to hurt you and maybe the people that you care about and you love the most. Because I want to talk today about guardrails as it pertains to our relationships and our sexual integrity. And I want to talk about this because it's so important. I want to talk about guarding your marriage. Or for some of us in the room, guarding yourself for marriage, perhaps. Or maybe even guarding yourself from married people. And see, unfortunately, many of us know all too well the devastating consequences of individuals in our lives who perhaps didn't have guardrails in this area of fidelity and sexual integrity, and it affected you in a negative way. And we realize that. In fact, I would wager that every single person in this room, you probably either are someone, or maybe you know someone, or you were raised by someone who didn't have guardrails in this area, and you've lived with the aftermath of that. And so today, I want to talk about this, because for many of us in the room, perhaps your greatest regrets, perhaps your most lingering pain that you've carried with you for years is connected to a sexual sin that was committed by you or maybe by someone that you cared about. And so we want to have this conversation today. Here's the question. How can we set up some guardrails that will help protect the fidelity of perhaps your most important relationship? What does that look like? What are the standards that are going to alert your conscience before you fly off the bridge? What's the guardrail that you can put in place to save you from that, right? What does that look like? So to kind of approach this conversation, what I want to do is I want to look at a scripture. I want to look at a passage of scripture to kind of give us some biblical framework, if you will, to kind of process this. And so what we're going to do is I want to look at one passage, and we're going to kind of take a deep dive into 1 Corinthians chapter 6 and look at one passage as it pertains to our fidelity and our sexual integrity. And we're going to look at that and kind of unpack that. And then I want to take the last little bit of our time together, and I want to really dive into some practical handles of how does this flesh out and actually intersect with our actual lives, and what are some potential guardrails that could help us as we try to avoid some of this unnecessary pain. So, 2,000 years ago, God inspired the Apostle Paul to write a letter to the church of Corinth. And in that letter, he addresses this very issue, and he just jumps right in. And this is what he says in 1 Corinthians chapter 6. He says this. He says, flee from sexual immorality. He says, flee from sexual immorality. Now, before I lose some of you and you start to kind of roll your eyes a little bit and you think, oh, here we go again. The church is just so old-fashioned and archaic. Hang on, stay with me. Okay, stay with me a minute. Because fleeing is exactly what every single husband in this room wants his wife to do. And it's exactly what every single wife in this room wants their husband to do. And it's what every single fiance in this room wants for their fiance. And it's what every single little brother wants for his little sister, or his older sister. It's what every single person who loves someone wants for them, because we realize that when it comes to our sexuality, we need to be very, very careful. And there are absolutely, unquestionably people and circumstances that we want them to flee from. Why? Because we care, right? And what makes this seem a little bit maybe old-fashioned, or maybe it just feels counterculture, is the reality is this: it is counterculture. Because everything in our culture encourages us to not flee from, but rather to flirt with, right? I mean, everything, all of our media, our the things that we entertain ourselves with, our movies, our music, our advertisements, the books that we read. I mean, everything in our culture promotes, sexual promiscuity. It promotes sex outside of marriage. It glorifies affairs. I mean, these are like normal storylines to the entertainment that we watch. Everything in our culture says, you know what, you don't need to flee from it. It's fine. You can flirt with it. We talked about this a couple weeks ago, that our culture says we don't need guardrails. It just says, just put some painted lines on the road, and, if you just kind of do what you want to do. It's fine. You want to go over here? You do you. That's fine, right? But yet Paul says, no. We need to flee. And it's not because God is against sex. In fact, as Christians, right, we believe that God actually created sex. God is for sex, right? Like, it's not he's against sex, but he gave us this extraordinary gift, but he gave us guidelines with it. And so the Apostle Paul, talking about sexual integrity, he says this. He goes on to say, he says, flee from sexual immorality. He says, all other sins. Now, what's he doing here? He's immediately putting sexual sin in a category all its own. He's saying, listen, this one is different than all other sins. It is uniquely damaging. It's different. It's in a different category. He says, man, you can make some poor choices financially or academically or professionally perhaps, but sexual sin, there's something about it that's different. It just has different consequences. Can we be forgiven? Absolutely. This isn't a conversation about does God forgive you? Does he love you? Absolutely. But can you fully escape the consequence? And Paul would say, no, you can't. Because sexual sin, it's just different. It oftentimes, and you know this, can create generational damage. Where it doesn't just hurt you, but in fact, the people that you love the most are affected by the choices that you made when it comes to this arena of sexual immorality. It oftentimes undermines your ability for intimacy. It undermines your ability to have healthy relationships in the future. It has this tendency to resurface in area after area after area. And sexual sin has a tendency to make you a liar and a secret keeper for the rest of your life, almost like anything else, unlike anything else. And some of the most tragic, conversations that you've had, you talk to people, and they'll talk about their past. They'll talk about their mistakes that they've made. You'll talk to them and say, yeah, when I was 22, and I made a really poor decision that night, and I got a DUI. I'm not really proud of it. Or they'll talk about, when I was younger, I made a lot of poor financial decisions, and I filed bankruptcy, and it kind of had this ripple effect, and I kind of wish I could have avoided that. They'll talk about all that, but for some reason, man, sexual immorality is different. We don't want to go there. We want to bury it. We don't want people to find out, because what would they think of us, right? And we just try to bury it, and we don't want people to know about that part of our life because we're too ashamed. And yet, some of the most heartbreaking situations are husbands and wives who stood at an altar and said, I do, and they said, I promise to tell you everything, and they told them part of their sexual history. But in only telling them part of their sexual history, they were able to kind of relieve their conscience maybe a little bit, and they were able to feel fine. And they stood at an altar, and they said, you know what? I'm promising forever. I'm promising everything. You can know my whole life and be fully known and fully loved. And yet, what they really meant is everything except for this, because I don't want you to know about this part of my life. I don't want to go there. And what they oftentimes fail to realize is those secrets often undermine the very trust and the fabric of that very marriage and relationship, and it hurts them, and it's causing these issues because sexual sin makes you a liar and a secret keeper for life. And what's amazing is the Apostle Paul, he knew about this 2,000 years ago. And he's saying, guys, this isn't unforgivable. It's not about that. He's saying this has nothing to do with God loving you or accepting you. This has everything to do with God caring about you and being for you. And he doesn't want you to go through this. And he's saying, listen, the consequences of sexual sin are just different. And we don't have to look far to understand that somehow they're able to move on from just about every other thing in life. But for some reason, when it comes to our sexuality, it tends to just follow us around and resurface in area after area after area, often for our whole life. And again, this isn't a forgiveness issue. This is the very nature of sexuality. And so Paul continues on. He says this. He says, all other sins that a person commits are outside of the body, but whoever sins sexually sins against their own body. Which begs the question, what does it mean to sin sexually? What does that mean? Well, when you look at the New Testament writings and you look at the other letters that Paul wrote and you look in the Gospels and you look at the writings of John, oftentimes what you see as sin is defined as this, as any time that you hurt or you steal from or you dishonor someone else, that's sin. That's wrong. It's really simple. It's really basic. Anytime that I put me before you to your detriment, that's a sin. It's wrong. Anytime you put you before me to my detriment, it's wrong, right? And we all get this intuitively. Like, we don't have to look far. I mean, you and I, we can't be okay if you have an issue with my kid. If you mistreat my kid, man, we've got a problem. I've got a son. His name's Davis. He's 2 years old. Got another one on the way. We're really excited. I'll tell you what, you and I, we can have lots of issues. You can be upset with me. We can hash that out. That's fine. But the second that you mistreat my kid, man, the pastor hat comes off, and we've got an issue, okay? And here's the thing. It's the same with God. God says, man, every single person that you have the potential to hurt is someone who is loved and cherished by God. And so he doesn't want you to do that. And here's the thing. As Christians, Jesus came and he gave us the platinum rule. You guys remember the golden rule? We all know that. We're supposed to do unto others as we would have them do unto us. That's great. But Jesus came and he upped the ante. He said, man, I'm going to take that a step further. He says, I'm giving you the platinum rule. He says, I want you to treat others not how you want to be treated. I don't care how you want to be treated. I want you to treat others how I treated others. I want you to love others the way that God through Christ loved you. He's saying this is the standard that we should live as Christians, right? Takes it to a whole nother level, whole more, this depth that we never experienced before. He says, listen, this is why. Sexual sin is any time you do something that hurts another person, it's wrong, right? And it's not because sex is bad, but it's because God loves the people that you're potentially hurting, and he loves you. And guess what? God doesn't want you to hurt you either. And see, when you take this extraordinary gift that was designed for an exclusive covenant relationship between two people, and you start to divvy that out amongst lots of people, not only do you hurt yourself, but you hurt those other people that are involved. Because when you take something that was promised to someone else or was intended for someone else, guess what? You're sinning against that person. And it has nothing to do with God being against sex. It has everything to do with God being for you and for those people. It has everything to do with God loving and cherishing and honoring you. And this is why this is such a big deal, because the consequences of sexual sin are different. And God loves you too much to keep his mouth shut. He doesn't want you to go through that. And so Paul says, man, whoever sins sexually, they sin against their own body. In other words, when you sin sexually, it's not just you're hurting yourself. It's not just you're stealing from that other person or you're dishonoring that other person, but you're actually hurting yourself. You're undermining your own future potential for intimacy. And so Paul says, man, this is in a category all its own. Your sexuality is fragile and it's precious. It's powerful, and you need to guard it. And so he goes on. He kind of switches gears a little bit, and he says, do you not know? Do you not know? In other words, there may be something that you may not know that if you knew it would change the way that you handled your sexuality. Saying there may be something that maybe no one ever explained it to you. Maybe you never fully understood it. But if you knew it, man, it has the potential to change the game for you. And what makes what he's about to say so powerful is it's not about consequence avoidance. He's already covered that. He just talked about avoiding consequences. Here's why. We know that there's consequences. We get all that. But he shifts the conversation. He says, hey, there's a much grander reason why you should avoid and flee from sexual immorality. And this is what he writes. He says, do you not know that your bodies are temples of the Holy Spirit who is in you and whom you have received from God? He's saying, do you not know who you are? Do you not know what you are? He said, you're a temple, to which you and I reply, a temple? Like, what is a temple? What is that, right? Because we don't use that in our culture, but they use this analogy on purpose and intentionally because a temple in those days, it was a place that was sacred. It was a place that was set aside. He's saying, you are sacred because God's Spirit resides in you, and that makes you incredibly valuable. And that means that God cares about you, and you have intrinsic value because you bear the eternal image of God. In fact, that's what Eikon means. You ever wondered why we call this church Eikon Church? It's because it means, man, every single person bears the image of God, and every single person has intrinsic value because of that, right? And so Paul says, man, maybe you just don't know that you're fine-tuned for relationship with God, that you're so valuable that you're designed specifically for intimacy with one other person because God is with you and he's in you. And he says this is so incredibly important because he writes this in the next verse. He says, you are not your own. You're bought with a price. And see, we all know intuitively that, man, the value of something is determined by the price it brings, right? Like I can try to say my phone is worth X amount all day long, but you know what my phone's worth? It's what I can get somebody to actually pay for it. And Paul brilliantly brings this back to the gospel. And he says, hey, listen, your Father in heaven loves you so much that he gave his son to demonstrate his love for you. He paid everything for you. That's how incredibly valuable you are to God. Therefore, he goes on to write, therefore, in other words, in light of the selfishness of sexual sin, in light of how valuable you are and how you are fine-tuned for relationship with God and others, in light of all of that, here's the application for today. Here's the big idea. This is what Paul writes. He says, therefore, honor God with your bodies. Honor God with your bodies. This is the New Testament sexual ethic. That you honor God with your body and you honor the bodies around you. This is what it means to walk with sexual integrity. It's not just consequence avoidance. We know there's consequence, but it's because every single person has value and they matter to God, and so we should treat every single person that we come in contact with the utmost love and respect. And see, if we began to see others the way that Paul writes about, the way that God sees others, man, it changes the whole dynamic of the conversation, right? All of a sudden, it influences the way that we interact. It influences the way that we date. It influences the way that we operate in our marriages. And this is why Paul says when it comes to sexual immorality, we need to flee because there's just so much at stake. But here's the reality. Fleeing requires guardrails, okay? Fleeing requires guardrails. And so what I want to do over the next little bit here, with that as kind of the backdrop, is I want to give you some suggestions as it pertains to guardrails around guarding your sexual integrity and guarding the fidelity of your marriage. I want to talk about this. If you're in a relationship, or maybe you want to be in a relationship, I want you to kind of lean in. But before we kind of get into it, let me just give you this disclaimer. If you think to yourself, as I kind of give you some of these suggestions, if you think, Steve, that just sounds so archaic, that just sounds so old-fashioned, I mean, you're just so out of touch with reality. If that's you, listen, that is so fine. I'm so good with that. You can absolutely ignore everything I'm about to say, okay? But here's what I would challenge you with. That you take time this week and you process for you what guardrails you need in your life, because this is so, so, so important. And there's so much at stake. So here's the first suggestion I have for you as it pertains to guardrails around your sexual integrity. Number one, I want you to talk about it, okay? I want you to talk about it. If you are married, or if you're engaged, or if you're in a dating relationship, you need to have a conversation with your significant other about guardrails. You need to talk to them. You need to know what she thinks. She needs to know what you think. You need to not assume that you're on the same page. You need to have a real, honest conversation and decide together. What are the guardrails that you need in your relationship? You know, what's appropriate behavior as it pertains to people of the opposite sex around the office? What's appropriate behavior there? What are you both okay with? What's appropriate behavior in your study group? What's appropriate behavior with that person who keeps texting you? You need to talk about that. Be on the same page. Maybe for some of you, your business has you traveling all the time and you're constantly catching flights from here to there and you're in hotels 50% of the time. Listen, if that's you, you need to have a real honest conversation with your spouse about what are the guardrails as it pertains to your travel. Okay? You need to establish those ahead of time so that you don't find yourself in a compromising situation where you're already flying off the bridge. Rather, set a guardrail. Have that conversation. You need to talk about it. As you talk about it, here's a suggestion that I have for you. I think that you should strongly consider is this. You need to avoid potentially problematic people. Okay? Avoid potentially problematic people. You say, well, who are they? You don't need me to tell you because you already know who those problematic people are in your life, okay? If you're in a relationship, if you're dating someone, you're married, here's a problematic person. It's when you go to the office and you can go left or you can go right, but you always go left because he sits there. That's a problematic person. You need to, as a matter of conscience, be honest and establish a guardrail to help you avoid problematic people in your life. You just got to be honest with yourself. It's that person who you just say, man, I don't know what it is. There's just this emotional energy there. I don't know if it's an attraction. I don't know what it is. But every time I walk by, I always notice them. And they always flirt with me. And there's these conversations. And they're texting me. Listen, you need to be honest. And you need to, as a matter of conscience, talk about it and establish a guardrail to help flee from problematic people that are going to, take you down a path you don't want to go. If you're in a dating relationship in here, or you want to be in a dating relationship, if you're in a dating relationship, this is important. You need to talk about physical boundaries. Okay, you need to have that conversation. The question I always get from people that are dating, they always want to know, hey, how far is too far? Where's the line at? What can I do and, God not be too upset with me if I do that? As long as I don't have sex, is that fine? We can do everything else. Is that cool? And listen, here's the problem with that is you're asking the wrong question. We need to go back to the scriptures and frame it the way that Paul framed it. The question isn't how far is too far. The question that you should be asking is, what does it look like for me to honor this other person? What does it look like for me to honor the Spirit of God in him? What does it look like to honor his or her future marriage, which, by the way, may or may not be with you? So what does it look like to honor? Because here's the reality. When you start talking about how far is too far, that's subjective. It's a slippery slope. It takes you on all these questions. It's confusing. It's unclear. But you know what's surprisingly clear? Honor. And when you frame the conversation like that, all of a sudden it changes the entire dynamic of the conversation. So as you're talking about this when you're dating, here's one that I would encourage you to talk about, is you need to avoid potentially problematic environments. Okay? You say, well, what do you mean by that? You just got to be honest. You need to avoid potentially problematic environments. You know that, man, if you are alone with your significant other and you're in an intimate place late at night, guess what? Things are going to happen, okay? I don't care how, strong you both are. Here's the reality. If you put healthy people in an unhealthy environment, unhealthy things will happen, okay? I'm just being honest with you. Listen, I've lived this. In fact, my wife and I, her name's Natalie. She was here last service. She left probably because of what I'm about to say. But she, listen, when we were dating, we talked about it. We had this conversation because Natalie, she had this problem. She couldn't keep her hands off of me. And I don't blame her. I told her that. I was like, listen, babe, I get it. I know how hard this must be on you. I mean, I get it. Believe me, no. But get a guardrail, okay? Like, seriously. I mean, come on. What's the matter with you? But seriously, we talked about it. We talked about, okay, what are the boundaries that we need to have in our relationship to make sure that we don't fly off a cliff and are a part of each other's future regret story. We don't want to do that. So talk about it. Talk about physical boundaries. Talk about what you're comfortable with. And while we're on this conversation of dating and this whole deal with physical boundaries and all that, I just want to remind you of the famous love chapter in 1 Corinthians chapter 13. You've heard this before. It's at every wedding. This inevitably comes up. It's the one where it says, love is patient, love is kind, doesn't envy, it doesn't boast. You guys remember that? I just want to remind you that very first one, that love is patient. And you know what that means in the context of a dating relationship? It means that love never pressures the other person. Love never pressures the other person to go further physically, okay? That's not love. And I just want to take a moment because, listen, if you were in a dating relationship and you feel pressured to go further physically than what you're comfortable with, you need to have a real honest conversation with your significant other. You need to talk about it. If you are in a dating relationship and you are constantly feeling pressure to go further than what you want to go, and it's just constant pressure, can I just tell you something? That is not love. That is an unhealthy relationship, and you may need to get out of that relationship. But at the very least, you need to talk about it. Okay, it's so, so important that we talk about it. Next suggestion here for you is this. Is you need to tell them about it. Okay, tell them about it. If you find yourself in a situation that's a little bit iffy, you need to tell your significant other about it. If you find yourself in a situation where it may just be a little bit compromising, you need to talk about that. You need to tell them what happened. Don't keep secrets in a committed relationship. It never leads to anywhere healthy. You need to watch out when you find yourself hesitating to tell. Okay? If you ever find yourself in this moment and you say, well, Steve, I didn't even do anything wrong, it was just the lunch, it was just a conversation, but yet there's something inside of you that's hesitating to tell your significant other. That should be a major red flag, and that should be something that catches your attention, that there's something more going on beneath the surface, and you need to tell them about it. You need to tell them about it. Especially if you find yourself in a moment where your heart is drifting towards an out-of-bound person, you need to tell someone. You need to talk to your spouse. Maybe you're saying, well, I don't know if I'm ready to have this conversation with my spouse. At the very least, you need to tell somebody. Okay, here's why. It's because oftentimes we try to internalize this stuff, and there's emotions, and there's all these thoughts, and it's just this snowball effect, and it's confusing, and it's going all these different directions, and there's fantasy, and it's all internal. But the second that you tell somebody, oftentimes what happens is just speaking of it can oftentimes diffuse it. Just letting someone in and saying, hey, man, I know this sounds crazy, but there's this person and nothing's happened, but here's where I'm at. And you just need to tell somebody what's going on. Never do guardrails alone. Isolation always hurts you. Some of you just need to find a friend that's close, and you just need to open up and let them in on some things that are going on beneath the surface in your life. And this is especially true around the area of pornography. And I just want to address this for a moment because pornography is a sexual sin that not only hurts you, it not only has the ability to undermine your ability to have future intimacy, but rather it goes a step further because it also hurts others. It dehumanizes and devalues women. It dehumanizes and devalues people. It's a sexual sin with real consequence, and you need to know that. And some of you, you've been trying to fight this thing on and off on your own for far too long, and you just need to tell somebody. You need to have some conversations. You need to be real honest about, man, this is something I'm struggling with. And you may need to create a plan, right? You may need to, some of you, you already know what you need to do, you just haven't done it. You need to pull your phone out before you leave here today. You need to delete some apps. Because you just know it doesn't leave me in a good place. You need to maybe set a guardrail in your life that, you know what, I'm not going to be on technology after a certain hour of night because for me, it just leads me down a path that I know I don't want to go down. You say, well, Steve, that sounds so extreme. Maybe that is extreme. But you know what else I know? Is that the consequences of sexual sin can be devastating. And I don't want you to go through that. I would much rather you set some extreme guardrails before you get to the danger zone, before you fly off the bridge, than have a conversation after the fact saying, I wish I would have. I've never met one person ever in years of ministry, I've never met one person who's ever regretted having a guardrail. But I've met dozens and dozens and dozens of broken people who said, I wish someone would have told me. I wish I would have had the courage to set up a guardrail, to have the conversation. Because listen, we need guardrails. There's just too much at stake. So as we wrap up today, you get to decide. Here's your question. Will you flee or will you flirt? You get to pick. You gonna flee or are you gonna flirt? Because flee honors God. Flee honors your spouse. Flee honors your kids, your future kids, your grandkids. Flee honors others. But fleeing requires guardrails. Some guardrails that are going to alert you before you fly off the edge. Some guardrails that are going to help you guard your heart and perhaps your most important relationships. And you know what? You're not going to be applauded now. If you establish these guardrails, man, no one's going to clap for you. No one's going to say, man, you're so awesome. No one's going to know. But 20 years from now, you're going to look back in your life and you're going to get to tell a story. And the kind of story that you get to tell is going to be determined by the decisions that you make today as it pertains to these guardrails. It's just true. You get to decide. And some of you may be in the room today and you say, well, Steve, man, I've already crossed some lines sexually. I've made mistakes. I've made poor decisions. I'm living maybe even the consequences of some of that, and I'm just too far gone. I just want you to hear loud and clear before we move on. I want you to hear this. God is not done with you. You're not too far gone. God is still writing a story with your life. And the amazing thing about stories is it's never too late to start a new chapter. It's never too late to start writing the kind of chapter that you're proud to tell. Okay? So don't give up, but decide today that, you know what? I haven't made the best decisions in the past, but today I'm drawing a line in the sand, and today I'm going to start writing a new story. And I love that we serve a God who's in the business of redemption and restoration. And you are at the beginning of this place where God can begin to restore things in your life that are broken. If you will just decide, you know what? I'm going to do this God's way. I'm going to establish some guardrails. I'm going to flee from sexual immorality. It could be the beginning of something beautiful in your life. So for all of us, you get to decide. Flee or flirt. And may you flee from sexual immorality, and may you honor God with your body and honor the people around you. And as you do that, may you step into God's best life as you decide to do things His way. So let me pray for you, and then we're going to move on and sing one more song together. Let's pray. God, I thank you that you are a good God.